Hey, it's Don. It's time for another video today. Video 41, and we're going to cover clocks in the beginning, and then I'm going to go into some more stamps on different things to look for, some specialty stuff. We're going to cut over there right now, and we're going to start with clocks. So now with clocks, this is one that I sold. Now, I've talked about clocks before. This clock, believe it or not, I paid $1 for, as well as two other clocks. For $5, I got table cleanup. I got 3 of these clocks included in there. None of them were spinning. One of them had a piece hanging off of it and a few other issues. For the most part, I fixed up these clocks a little bit. There is a pin that most people don't know in these clocks. And that's key to knowing whether these are worth messing with or not. Now, most of these, if you can get them for a couple bucks, regardless of the issue, if they're all brass, the inner workings are worth money. And you can at least get 15 or 20 bucks for the workings without the dome. The dome itself can go for 20 or 30 bucks on the right day. It just depends. Most people don't mess with clocks in general. Most people don't mess with clocks in general. Part of the reason is that to have a clock repaired is horrendously expensive. It's like 150 bucks just to have somebody look at a clock and tell you what's wrong with it. Call around yourself if you're curious on that. I've done it before and called. These days, I pretty much will attempt it myself. There are some things that you can do on most clocks. The spring that's in the back of most clocks gets sticky and stuck together. You can literally take out that spring, and it's usually encased. You do not want to open up those cases if the spring's in there without knowing what you're doing, though, because those things will shoot out with a ton of force, and it's just basically a metal serrated edge kind of on there. So when it's flapping around, you can really get cut bad. So don't do it if you don't know. Be very cautious. I've seen it happen. I've taken apart many. We've tested and seen what happens when it does happen. I'm very cautious. But if you take out the inner section, you can just drench that thing in WD-40. And if you have an open case, at least in one spot, because you should be able to see the spring, if you push and loosen up the spring inside there, usually that's enough to get them working again. Usually, again, as I said, those springs get stuck together from dust and stuff that have embedded themselves in there for years and years, and that's what's sticking together. Once that's off with a bunch of WD-40, it usually works for me. Most clocks, that's the key to it. Now, it doesn't have to keep correct time. All it has to do is work. Let somebody else worry about it from that point. But if you can state that it works, keeps time for a certain length of time, you're all set. Most clocks I will test for days in here, and usually it's a wind-up type clock that we're talking about here. Now, this one here has a, well, let's show you where the pin's at first. Now, most of these have a pin. Let me zoom in here. Now, you see a glass tube with like a real thin piece of wire going down it on the far right of the actual clock. Down at the base is a little cotter pin. That prevents it from actually being able to move. Once you pull that pin out, to the right of that little cotter pin is a little round knob. If you slide that over, that frees the spinning ball pendulum part at the bottom, so it will spin again. This protects the wire and such forth when it's traveling and things like that. All of the clocks that I bought were marked as not working, won't spin. All of them had a cotter pin, and all of them were able to be actually used. Now, I made almost $500 off those $3 investment on the clocks. I did clean them up. I did do some stuff to them. So it wasn't like I just bought them and then they were sold. Basically, I've gotten another hour at most into all of them and to clean them up. Includes cleaning the domes and stuff. They were cake. They were just filthy. Most people, didn't think anything of it. So much so that they sat through the entire auction and they were sitting there. So, and I've bought many of these. Every one I've bought has sold. Now, this one's been up for a year and a half. Not a problem for me. I have nothing into it. I even forgot I still had this. It was up on a top shelf. So, anyway, I knew where it would be if if it sold. So, no worries there. But that's the key to this. The other thing to think about, again, as I said, is the brass weight in these. So sometimes the brass, you might see $5 for the clock, but there may be, say, 20 bucks in brass. Brass is like $3 a pound or better at any given point. It's in that price range. So keep that in mind. Again, if this had no dome to it, didn't work, there were some pieces, I would have still been able to sell the inner actual mechanism, the actual inner workings, this part here. It's a good company. It's a decent manufacturer. It's brass. So We won't dwell on my item again. This is just why I'm talking about this. Here's another one. This is an earlier version, $697. Again, it doesn't matter if they work. Some of the newer ones are just as good to sell. They all usually have a locking system of some sort. They all connect up the same where the actual spinner at the bottom is. It's just a little wire that holds those. So if you're not careful too, you can snap that wire. Now, any of these atomic ones too. Now, some of them can have balls on the end. This is just for an example. Any of these sell for us. And I usually find these at estate sales and garage sales, especially. I've seen them at auctions and the whole works. Now, it depends on who made them, of course, but most all of these are worth 50 or 60 bucks. Again, atomic starburst clocks are what you're looking for on these. I'm just throwing out a few clocks here because clocks are always good for us. Electric ones as well too, but any of the wind-up ones that are brass, I can usually mess around with and at least get them to click and tick and run for a couple days. That's the key to it. That's all I worry about. I don't worry if they keep perfect time. As long as they chime and all the whole stuff on there, that means they're at least fixable. So, in most of the time when you sell a clock like that, it's being sold to a clock person in the first place. It's the only people nowadays who can really afford to fix a clock. You'd have to pay, and I'm telling you, it's hundreds of dollars to fix a good clock, and it's just not worth it unless it's like a grandfather clock and it's going to sell for thousands. So. Now, I'm not worrying about the brand on this one here. This is a PAM clock, P-A-M. And there's almost always one of these labels here on the back. There are many different types of constructions on this. This is a standard reverse lighted clock. It doesn't matter what's on the front for the most part. Most of these are worth $100 or $2 minimum on almost any one of these advertising clocks. I don't care if it works either, even if the cord's cut, because sometimes people just put these up on the wall. Now, if the inner workings are gone, do not mess with these unless they're dirt cheap. So just keep that in mind on these. Now, the other one here to think about is a double bubble. Now, a double bubble, my wife's wanting this one. So next time I run into one, if we do, that's not all messed up, she'll probably get to keep it. When we're in the state where we can do this nowadays. 3, 4, 5 years ago, we couldn't have afforded that. But nowadays, she'll get to keep it. Bottom line here is, though, that it's actually a double bubble. Let's see if we can show you here. Now, the first bubble is the internal part where the word Pepsi-Cola is. And you can see that. That's a bubble inside there in glass. And then on top of that is a secondary bubble with the actual numbers, which is the outside part. So it technically is a double bubble, and it's lit from behind. Now, this one looks like it's missing a bulb, or maybe a bulb's out or something. Yeah, only half of it's lit, so the left half of the sign's lit. And again, I don't care what the brand is. I don't care even the maker. You won't even matter at all. It's just a double bubble on any type of glass clock. Double bubble is what you want. Those are the prima ones. They'll always sell for a couple $100. And then another thing I wanted to talk about real quick is Ansonia. Ansonia clocks. Now, the reason I'm talking about these is because the figures that are on the clock show up all the time on their own. They're pot metal. Sometimes they're not finished on the bottom. They might be broken. There might be a piece off. These are incredibly easy to repair. An average Ansonian figure from a clock is like $100. Just the figure, not the clock. Clocks go for a ton more, as you see here. But those figures show up at flea markets quite often. Estate sales or auctions as well, even church sales. Most people think it's just a cheapo white metal pewter decoration of some sort. Most of those type that are metal, white metal on the inside, you look inside of it, are going to be Ansonian clocks, especially if they've been bronzed. So look for any figure, and they made them for everything. Heads and horses. Horses are about the only one that I wouldn't worry too much about if you find them, because most of those aren't worth a ton of money. And a lot of those aren't Ansonian. They're modern day for electric clocks when you see a horse with a clock next to it. So, but the old ones, the ones that are made out of pot white metal and that are bronzed to match something similar to this, are a different story. Especially the ones that are rearing up. You don't just want a standing horse. It's about the only one I don't want you to mess with. Don't mess with standing horses unless they're really cheap. Any other form of a horse is really good. Standing up, rearing, running, bucking, any of that kind of stuff. Most any other animal is good. Any of these angels, cherubs, They're pot metal. That's the key. Ansonian. It's not going to say Ansonian on it either. So any of those figures you want to snag up for 10, 15, 20 bucks, anywhere in that range. So just FYI. Now, Chronos. Now, I used to work in foods. We had key systems and time clocks. You can buy out, and I've talked about doing this as well, you can buy out businesses that run auctions. Like a restaurant going out of business, and look and see what their systems are before you decide if you're going to go. Now, if they're on a Chronos system, I always go. Always, always. Some of these you can get dirt cheap. You might only pay $400 or $500 for 8 or 10 of these units that would have run a whole restaurant. They go for incredibly high amounts of money, these Chronos systems. You want with the bio. That's the key to most of these. So they'll have to come on. So as long as it's from a closed down business, most of the time you're lucky that the bio and everything is intact. They haven't wiped the system out. So just FYI, Chronos. It goes along with time in my book. These you're going to have to go to some specialty sales or businesses closing down. Don't always go to the big, huge, sales that you think are going to be the best or the auctions. Sometimes an individual business going out may be worthwhile going to. You might be surprised at what stuff they may be holding in their warehouse. It may have been some other business before whatever the business is right now is going under. So there might be other stuff left over. And I find that quite often at these type of sales. So they've sold 3 at $700. So, and that's cheap. You could put them together in a lot. That you might do better if you have 10 matching ones as opposed to selling 10 individual ones separately. Just keep that in thought here, because sometimes that's better. Just because people say, oh, there's a whole system, I'm done, they all match, and I'm ready to go. These are still cheaper than buying new ones. So that's why they may pay a little more to get a matching system. No problems with interacting between different ones. The whole system would update at the same time. They'd all be linked in, the whole works. So I won't dwell on that too much. This one's here is just for an oddity. Type in Art Deco Japanese fishbowl and just take a look at this one here. Most people might miss that this is even a clock. Now it says, I think, goldfish. Those aren't goldfish, they're angelfish, just FYI. But not even sure on the age on this one. But there's some weird clocks that you wouldn't know were clocks unless you spent some time looking at it. Somebody might walk by this. It's almost $700. So anyway. Now, Old Navy clocks and things like that. This is restored, and I repair. That's the only reason I put this one up here. If it's done properly and it looks legit, you can get away with repairing stuff. They can still sell for a decent amount of money here, as you can see. So just keep that in mind. Now, they've really cleaned this up. I don't know how well they did in the brass, but it's still a nice job. The face is what I would worry about. Either way, it looks like a nice piece. It can be disassembled and put back together. The whole works. Almost $700 again on that one. Now, the last one here, GE wall clocks. This one's Bakelite. Now, any of the old school clocks go for 50 or 60 bucks on average. That's what I get. I've showed one. I've got one sitting behind me that we got not too long ago. So anyway, that's just something to think about. And I thought about showing you fixing and taking out a spring on a clock, but every clock is different. And if I show you something, there might be some other oddball thing that may not be the same in your clock, and I wouldn't want you to bust something. Most of them, though, if you spend a few minutes looking at, there's a few screws that are holding on the spring mechanism that you take out. Take it out in one piece. You can literally put it in a bucket and spray the heck out of it with WD-40 in any little crevice. You'll have to let it drain and drip for days. But again, you want to play around with the spring when you do this, just so you can make sure that you're freeing it up on the inside. Again, it's mostly hair. Some of these clocks that I mess with are 100 years old or older, so you just got to think about that. Now, I don't mind if they're electric, if they're like industrial, things like that. That stuff always sells. So this one's a better example. This is a GE, but there's many other different versions of them as well, too. Just another example. Art Deco always sells. There's a clock that looks almost like this. This is the Zephyr, and there's a clock, I think, called the Zephyr as well, too. So just FYI, they all go very well. Another one, this is a moving eye, and people confuse this with cuckoo clocks. It's not a cuckoo clock. The eyes move, and that's just the box that's needed to house the actual workings. Any one that's wood that has moving parts is good to get. Again, keep your eye on the cost you're paying for something like this. This is probably German, black forest of some sort, still in the same area, but the eyes move back and forth. So this is the precursor to like the Felix the Cat and stuff. So 800. Any weird animals that you wouldn't expect to see in a clock and would usually go for good money, even bronze ones, but this would have been a hop on for a couple $100 in my book. And we're going to pop into stamps here. Now, I've talked about canceled. We're going to talk about canceled and a few other things while we're doing it here, because these are things that I look for. These are going to determine more so sometimes what the value is on a collection or something, more so than just looking through the book itself. And the other part why I'm showing you these as opposed to just stamps only, because these will show up in other places. These don't have to show up in a stamp book. Now, if you're at an estate sale of a soldier, and that's a third of every estate sale I go to, maybe even more than that, has, history with somebody serving in the military. It was bigger back in the day for some of these folks that, are passing away at this point, that are in their 80s or 90s now, or whatever age. I'm not trying to discourage or criticize anybody for an age, so don't take that as all, but this is from a prisoner of war. Now, didn't look into the whole logistics of this, and why they were a prisoner of war in 1950. I don't know what was going on. I don't know what the deal is in this, and I'm not interested in that aspect of it. The point is that it's a cover from 1950 that does not look like anything special, and it went for $2,500. So, take some heart into what you're looking at. You may not know what's going on, but if it's coming from some oddball city in China that you've never heard of and being sent to somewhere else in that general vicinity, it could hold some value. Almost any of them. And this is one of those cases where I do auction. I'll use an auction specifically. I know I very rarely talk about it, but I never know on some of these items. You can almost safely list a China item for a reasonable price if you're doing it as an auction, because if it's good, it's going to go for some good money. Just do them for 10 days. Almost every one of these, if they're valuable, there's the Chinese collectors are horrendously crazy about this stuff, and they've got watch warnings and notifications that set when these are listed. I have never had an issue selling something that was good from China, even at an auction. That's the one exception that I will almost always take a chance doing it that way. But again, there could be some China items that you looked up and all the comps were selling in the $200 range. I may still do a bid on that one for $400 and see what happens. So I will price China items higher sometimes. There's no way to know specifics on these covers, though. That's why I say this is one of those areas you might want to do an auction for. Just to keep an example on that. Now, here's an overprint. Now, it doesn't matter if an item is used or not to have value. If there's something else going on with the stamp, it could be totally cluttered where you can barely see what the stamp is. Now, this one has Hong Kong at the top. This is a Hong Kong stamp printed by the British government. It's got the Queen on it. It's got a Shanghai stamp, cancel. Well, you can't quite tell that unless you know your stamps. There's numbers on some of these, and that number designates where it came from. But on here, this is a 16-cent stamp that was overprinted with 10 cents. But the problem with that is they've inverted the 10 cents, so it's upside down. This is one of those things, unless you know to look for inverted stuff like that, you're going to miss them. This one stamp went for $2,500. So you could buy a book of stamps. There could be one or two stamps in there, something really weird or bizarre. But if you don't know what to look for, you're not going to find them. Anything that's printed upside down that shouldn't be is good. Now, not a cancel. Now, I'm not talking about the cancellation. I'm talking about an overprint that says like a new price on it, or an occupied, or it says U.S. Army, or occupation, or proof, or sample, or anything like that. That's what we're talking about here. So now here is the U.S. stamp number 2. Now I know you're not probably going to find this, but this is just an example of what you may see. It may show up in a book. I've found some of these in books. A pair is always better. These are used. The key to this one is the cancellation on these are red. And just the style, it's a grid. It's a crossed off pattern of crosses and crosses all the way across it. And they've actually got it certified as well, too, as you can see here. So, and they'll basically be mounted on the card with like a crystal mount, basically, you would say. Just a real good example here on this one here. They're certified, $2,600. The cancellation could have added $1,000 to those values. Just FYI. Here's another one too. Again, there's the color variations in some of these too. This says paid. As I've shown you, I have some paid. Now this one's a little different because it's in a lozenge shape. It's in like a pill-sized shape instead of the round one like I have in some. It depends on this. Now, there's books of just cancellations, and you could pin down the exact city on some of these by what the cancellation looks like, which I'm going to show you as well too. You can deep search some of that information on Google search, Chrome, or you can go to some Reddits and find out and post a copy of the actual cancel. And most of the times you get an answer. Again, they could increase the value 1,000-fold. Like this stamp here is not worth that much on its own. This is another one of the blackjacks. Andrew Jackson, they call it the blackjack. It's the black inked version. It's a blackjack. Now here's a section from the book. This cancellation was only used in Waterbury, Connecticut between 1866 and 68. Clearly see it's the same one. No other cancellation marking was on there to tell you where it was from. And this is from an ex-Skinner auction, so they know what this was. It sold for $1,800. So you're adding more than $1,000 just because of that used cancellation on that stamp. So I do get excited about this. I love seeing it. I've called out Mr. Fancy Cancel, which is who's selling this before. So pay attention to that name if you would. Again, Mr. Fancy Cancel has a lot of good stuff. You can follow him and get some good information from him. I follow him. I very rarely follow any sellers, but I do check his stuff out fairly often. He is like one of the key ones in the category. He's been on for a long time and has his credentials shown in his name, which you can't do anymore. So now here's just an example of Korean stamps from 1947-48. $1,100. This is a receipt for something, for purchases. So it's an interesting item. They're scarce stamps. You got to kind of know a little something about it. In older Korean stamps, the first letter of the word Korea is spelled with a C. So just keep that in mind. The spelling on some words you're going to have to look up through a Google search sometimes. It will not say the country name in a word you will understand sometimes. But if you do a search, a quick search, you'll be able to find out most country names. This is also why I say to have a copy, an older 80s or 90s or even before copy of the actual price guides. I wouldn't go below, say, 70s for these price guides. Here's another Shanghai China copy. Every time I see a China cover with Shanghai, I look. Suzhou is the city. This is why it's worth something. That Suzhou cancellation right there. That's the key to this one here. There's some secondary, the IP markings on there too, but this is a good one here. Just because of where it's going from and to. It's just a real good example, honestly. It's come from Bremen, which I believe is in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. Now, there's not many new ones that go for $1,000. But this is an exception. Mr. Rogers. This person has sold 5 for $1,000. It's rare because this first cancellation was done in several places, but one specific place that it was done was the actual studio where Mr. Rogers was shot and filmed. That's why this one goes for so much. It's very limited. It was never mailed. It's a nice example. Has advertisements for the channel on it. It's an official card from the channel that would have been handed out in 2018 for almost nothing. So just keep that in mind. There are some new ones too. Now, cancellation or not, this is just an example here on other factors that make things worth money. Rare centering. Some stamps are always off center, and sometimes they're even cut where they've printed off where you can't see part of the stamp, or 2 parts of stamps. You'll see a line down the middle, half a stamp on one side and the other half on the other. Those are misprints or misperforations. Those are worth money. But some stamps, the centering on them can double the value. If this one was off center more, it would have been worth less. So people miss stuff like that. You may not realize it. You may see, hey, every one of these stamps goes for $75, but you may look and realize that, hey, every one of those is off center. So if you get one that's centered on some stamps, these earlier 19th century stamps, this is 1870s, 1860s-ish, somewhere in that range, that can have a big factor in the price. Just keep that in mind when you're looking at these. Look up the centering on these higher dollar stamps. Again, anybody can find stamps. I have found stamps my whole life Since we've been reselling, there's pretty much always some sort of stamp purchase I can make. Craigslist has been good on stamps. There's not a lot of people that buy them because there's not a lot of people that know them. Think about that. You don't know them, and most everybody that I know does not know them. I've been into them since I was like 7, so I know stamps. Now here again, Waterbury, same city, different cancellation. 1866 this specifically dates from. There was some postmasters, and the reason these date from certain times, the postmaster who was in charge then liked this and maybe knew somebody would make these for him. Just a perfect example. This stamp is an 1860s Civil War era stamp. The stamp itself only goes for $5 to say $50, depending on the actual version. There's several that look almost identical, but the cancellation added at least $800 on average to this stamp. So again, cancellations are huge, and I talk about that. Mr. Fancy cancel again. Now here's another example of something different. It's got a fake cancellation. Some stamps, there's no examples of cancellation, so it adds to the value. I couldn't go into detail on this specific one. Maybe it's the color scheme or something. The fake cancel doesn't deter the value on some of these. It's just still worth some money on some of these, so take that in consideration. Repairs, the same thing. You can repair stamps, and it will increase the value depending on the stamp. So now this one here is British Columbia, so this is a different area. It's not something that shows up very often. Vancouver, it's a good example here. It's got a number 10 in the center. Now, somebody from the area may know number 10 was done in this specific city. It's a strip of 3 as well, too. So sometimes when stamps are used, they can be worth more than some unused stamps because they're in blocks as well, too. So when you find like a block or a pair like this, I do not split up any stamps. So just keep that in mind. Look into some of these stuff. If you haven't heard of it, it doesn't mean it's rare either, because if you're novice to stamps, you probably haven't heard of most of the stamps, the specifics on them. So take that in consideration as well. Now, I showed a page of some of these as well, too. Now, I get these quite often if I dig hard enough. This is $664. These have red Maltese crosses on them. It's just a collection. People collect different actual cancellations. They'll try to get every variety of a certain cancel. That's just a fact on these. So we'll show you a better Maltese cross in just a few minutes here. So anyway, this one went, as I said, $664 because of those cancellations. The stamps themselves aren't worth that much. It's an 1840 stamp, which are very early. The U.S. didn't put out actual full-fledged government-printed stamps till 1847. So now, again, cancellations from specific cities. This is a bumblebee, and this one's carded. This is an earlier one, too. This is a way earlier one, 96. This was actually carded on here. This is from Adrian, Michigan. Again, if you send these in, they can increase the value. And sometimes I have sent in stamps. This, again, I very rarely will say send something in, but stamps in some cases, if you know enough and know you're not going to get skunked and you know you just need to make sure it's real, that's the way to go with these. Send them in. Again, this is an earlier one, so it doesn't quite dictate it. Now, this is probably a photo. Some of the newer ones actually have the stamp mounted to it, too. So, again, the stamp itself is worth $6, $7, $8 on average. You can look up the stamp itself. It's number 114, Scott's number. But with this cancel, it's $575. So it adds over $500 to that one. Here's a roller cancel. It's a machine that rolls it across it as it goes through it. So, and again, high dollar stamps, $5 Canadian, 1897. This is like a Jubilee set. Most of those have some value, especially the high dollar ones. And this cancel adds a lot to the value, a couple $100. Canceled here. Now, here's Korea. Now, this doesn't say Korea. You're just going to have to know after a while. It has like an odd, almost like a yin and a yang, where the colors complement each other in the center circle there. I know the difference on these after years of looking at these. In fact, it says yin yang in the center there. I didn't even see that there. Sorry. This is a good example of stuff that people miss. Most people miss this kind of stuff. I've taken chances in the past and just listed something for back in the day when it was safe to list 99-cent auctions and stuff, just to see what happens. And I've learned over the years to tell which ones are which and things along that line too. So cancellation does help on this one. It can be pinned down to a specific city as well. Now here's another example that you're going to have to look up. Now those stamps, I have those too, mind you, and I think I've shown them actually in one of my videos. But you'll have to look up the actual names on there on a Google search to see what country it's from, in all honesty. I know you can see Franco, but it's a French occupational or a French territorial city stamp kind of thing here. Early covers are usually good. I never would recommend taking off at all. The other thing I would say, this has been sorted too, but this is the catalog value, $18,000. That's why I said don't pay attention to the catalog value because it only went for $609. Most of these foreign ones don't have the collectors that you would see here for the U.S. ones. Some do. Some countries do, like Israel stamps are very highly sought after. They didn't come about till the 40s, so anyway. Now here's another example of a cancellation. This is a 5-pounder, so it's worth some more because of just the amount, but it's from a specific place, Grace Church, and it's registered from the church. Now, the Church of England is part of the government in England. They actually hold seats in Parliament, if you didn't know that. So there's some church tie-ins to some of these too. That's why you might see it registered here in this country. It might be different. You wouldn't see like a private cancellation for a church that I know of. This one went for more because it is a special cancellation as well too, so... Here's another example. This has got a light cancel, but it's got a neat, interesting cancel. It's actually Vancouver Island on the actual cancellation, which you can see the word island, and you can see the last two letters of Vancouver as well. So this one increased the value a little bit because it was mailed from there as well. Now, it's not perfectly square. It was cut poorly or ripped off at the bottom. Again, centering is key. Another thing to think about on centering, sometimes people will trim off perforated stamps to make them look like an imperforated stamp. In most of the price guides, there's a size. You should know the size and look up the size of the stamp. If it's something that has both examples, make sure you're not marking as one thing and find out later on that somebody trimmed the stamp. So just keep that in mind. Same thing goes for the imperf ones where they'll trim it to make it center, as I said, or just trim off a perforated stamp to make it imperforated. Either way, they do that. Those are cons that many people do. Now here's Kowloon again. This is a nice example. Maku. Now this is from Japanese occupation. Now the Maku stamp up there is a Japanese printed stamp as far as I'm under the impression. It was sent from there to Kowloon. A real good example of these covers. And this is World War II. So that's why I say a lot of these covers show up in GI brought-backs. A lot of these show up sometimes in GI brought-backs or letters mailed from the Asian theater to their spouses or family members. So that's why I'm showing you these, because it's not just stamp collections you find these. Half of these type of materials show up in like love letters and things along that line. And somebody else asked the question, are love letters worth money? Yeah, for the most part they are. Now this one I'm just showing here because people might miss this one here. It doesn't look like much. It's just a cheapo looking, almost machine printed stamp. This is just an early Hawaiian stamp. It's worth some good money. So it's in the price guide. It's number 16. Anyway, $576. It's got a blue cancel too, as you can see there. The colored cancels are what I look for. Again, here's Mr. Fancy Cancel. Again, I didn't necessarily pick him out, but he has so many good examples. These were just random ones that happen to be his. So now this is a Masonic one. Again, this one can be pinned down to Clyde, Ohio, specifically. So just keep that in mind. Again, here's another page from the book. This is something that turns up in my area, and this is something I look for. You should know the local area, what's possibly around your area. Now, I don't have this book, but I have friends, so they play a big part sometimes in IDing some of these. But this example is a perfect example of something to look for. Again, the stamp itself is only worth a couple bucks, but the cancellation adds $500 to it, so pay attention to that. That can determine whether you're going to make a lot of money or just a few bucks on a collection here. These stamps you do want to still look for, so if you see a bunch of these, and I mean a bunch in a book for $100 or something, it might be worth it. If they have a cancellation like this, and, you know, most people don't think cancellations are worth anything, they're going by the stamps, you could be the one that could score on this because you know to look for specific cancellations. Just another example. This is number 1, though. As I said, Franklin's on 1, Washington's on number 2. This is the first U.S. stamp ever printed. It's the first U.S. stamp ever printed. It's got another red grid cancellation. The colored cancellations were big back then. So that's why they're hot. They're good items to get. Later on in the 1880s and stuff, it was harder pressed to find the colored cancellations. Another Waterbury one. Again, this gentleman or this city was priding themselves on these cancellations. It's a pumpkin. And it's, again, just a couple dollar stamp, $5 to $10, $15 stamp at the most. It's 114 again, at $482. So again, over $400 added because of the cancellations on them. Another blackjack. Now, there's one other thing that you should know on stamps too. Now, this one might be a little harder to show you. In fact, I think it's better from a little distance. Now, there's what's called a grill. And here you can see it very well right there. It's a grill on the stamp. Now, a grill is basically like an embossing that's super embossed and hard pressed into the stamp so that when it's canceled, there'll be areas that are raised and areas that are sunken in that all retain the ink, so you can't clean it off. A big thing back then was to wash and get rid of the ink and then use stamps over again. There's a whole industry around reusing stamps. This was an attempt to stop it. And there's tons of different sizes of grills and styles of grills. This is a D grill. They determine them by how many dots or how many images. Sometimes it actually makes an image or something on the stamp. You can't always see them like this. You're just going to have to get to know them. There's also watermarks, which won't show up on a stamp. So you might see a normal stamp, used or not, you can check. There's a chemical called hydrotetrachloride, and that's what you use to tell. If you put a stamp in there, whether it's used or not, it will show you that, and it will not ruin the actual gum on the back, believe it or not. You can pull it out, and it still will be just fine with hydrotetrachloride. I keep it in-house. And that's just what I use it for, is telling watermarks and stuff. So this same stamp could have a watermark embedded into it and a grill. All of that adds to the money value to them. That's stuff that novices miss. Now here's just an example of the Maltese cross. So just a real good example. Any of these penny British ones from the 1840s and 50s I buy up, even if they're $1 or so a piece, just because I can usually get $3 or $4 minimum. Usually I'll save up and I'll put them in a lot. I can crank it out to $6 or $7 on some of these when I put them in a lot, because people want quantity on these. They want a collection. They want something impressive looking, and it looks impressive to have a bunch of these stamps. Now here's just another example with one with a grill, and again, it's another one of the members of the actual group, which was on for a long time. Stamp collectors are diehard collectors, and they'll be on for years and years and years. This is a good source to sell stamps on, in all honesty. Again, the grill adds to the value. This stamp is not an expensive stamp, but when you add a grill to it, because this stamp could come with or without a grill, and it could come with 10 different grills for all I know. Each one has many different types, and this one I think says Dolvile H grill. Again, there's many different grills for these, and all that means is it was embossed in the paper. Now, we talked about repairing and stuff too, so I'm just going to show you one real quick one here. The quickest and easiest repair most people do is to regum a stamp. They're not worth as much as the original, and I'm just going to show you an example. This is the very first commemorative U.S. stamp ever issued, 1893. It's the Columbian Exposition or Chicago World's Fair from 1893. So this stamp is always something that I look for. Columbus is on him. It's his whole expedition. This is the highest dollar one from that set. This one here now has some pencil on the back. I wouldn't deter that from it. No gum, NG, no gum, and H for hinged. And you can see the remnants of the hinge, and that means something on this as well too. Now, comparing that, here is a regummed version of it. It's going only for $600. So, again, if the stamp was the same, the difference in price is around $300 versus a gummed one versus an original untouched one. Sometimes it depends on the day of the week, of course, so sometimes the prices could be reversed, but for the most part, a regummed stamp will not sell for as much as a original gum stamp too. But you can still do that, and in some cases, regumming stuff will increase the value. You can regum stamps at your house. There are machines that you can buy if you're heavy into stamps, just like the stamp presses and paper presses that I use. Those are for stamps specifically, what I originally bought them for, and then we've expanded out, and I use them for many other things, including repairing stuff. So now you can repair stamps too. If a stamp is ripped, you can back it with Chinese acid-free rice paper and acid-free glue. I would never do a repair on a stamp without doing that. It's just something you can do as well. And stamp repair is really easy. It's just a matter of gluing it back together, setting it, face side down, and carefully re-gluing it. Usually I will reglue and back the entire stamp, depending on the type of stamp that it is, if I'm doing a repair on one spot. Just what I do, it makes it look uniform, and it's not as noticeable from what I see. I never would retouch color or anything else. All I would do is reattach or fix it up or complete a stamp. So if there's a little segment missing, I may put a patch in there and fix it that way. The reason people will buy repaired postage stamps is because they're fillers, they're called. People want to have one of everything, and they can't afford a good copy of it. They will settle for repaired stamps any day of the week, a large chunk of the population. Maybe the top 10% may not do that. They'll just wait and hold out and get the best example and get one that's not damaged. But the other 90%, most people that I know who are into stamps, will take a damaged or repaired copy of a stamp to get a filler and fill the space in. So anyway, that's what I have for you today. Well, there you go again. Thank you, everybody, for the support that I do get. Hopefully you do find these videos in here helpful and useful. I try to center in more on the information here as opposed to just random assortments on YouTube. If you need anything ID'd or something, you can use the community tab and post pictures there. Again, I do thank you, and I do hope you have a good day.